The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly down the marble corridor. His footsteps echoed softly against the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. George had always been observant for his age, while other children his age might miss the subtle tensions that existed within palace walls. He noticed everything. The way certain staff members spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. The quick glances exchanged between security personnel. The slight changes in routine that most people would overlook. This particular morning, George was on his way to his private study session with his tutor when he noticed something unusual. Guard Thompson, a man who had been part of the Royal Protection Team for nearly 8 years, was standing at his usual post near the East Wing entrance. But something about his posture seemed off. His shoulders were tense, and there was a distant look in his eyes that George had never seen before. Thompson had always been kind to George. Unlike some of the other guards who maintained strict professional distance, Thompson would sometimes share a friendly nod or a quiet, "Good morning, Your Highness," when their paths crossed. George had grown to appreciate these small moments of human connection in a world that often felt formal and structured. As George passed by, he offered his usual polite greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." The guard turned, and for just a moment George saw something flicker across his face. Was it sadness? Frustration? It was gone so quickly that George wondered if he had imagined it. "Good morning, Prince George," Thompson replied, his voice carrying its usual respectful tone. But George detected something underneath, a heaviness that wasn't normally there. George continued to his study, but throughout his morning lessons on British history and mathematics, his mind kept wandering back to that brief interaction. His tutor, Mrs. Hamilton, noticed his distraction more than once. "Prince George, you seem particularly thoughtful today," she observed during their break. "Is there something on your mind?" George considered telling her about his observation, but decided against it. Instead, he simply said, "I was just thinking about how people communicate without words sometimes." Mrs. Hamilton raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this unusually philosophical comment from her young student. "That's quite perceptive. Body language and subtle cues can indeed tell us a great deal about how someone is feeling." After his lessons, George found himself taking a longer route back to his private quarters, one that would lead him past Thompson's post again. This time he walked more slowly, taking care to observe not just Thompson but the entire environment around him. What he noticed made him pause. Thompson wasn't just standing at his post. He was standing differently than usual. His weight was shifted slightly as if he was favoring one leg. His hand occasionally moved to his lower back in a subtle gesture that suggested discomfort. These were tiny details that most people would never notice. But George had always been exceptionally aware of the people around him. That evening at dinner, George sat with his parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine. The conversation flowed easily between topics of school, upcoming royal engagements, and family plans. But George found himself thinking about Thompson again. "Father," George said during a quiet moment in the conversation, "how do you know when someone needs help but doesn't want to ask for it?" Prince William set down his fork and looked at his eldest son with interest. "That's a thoughtful question, George. Why do you ask?" "I've been thinking about pride," George replied carefully. "How sometimes people might be struggling with something, but they don't want others to know because they're worried about appearing weak or causing trouble." Princess Catherine smiled at her son's insight. "You're very observant, darling. It's true that many people find it difficult to ask for help, especially when they feel it might affect their job or how others see them." "What would you do in that situation?" George asked. Prince William considered his answer carefully. "I think the key is to approach the situation with kindness and discretion. Sometimes people need to know that others care about their well-being, without feeling like they're being judged or that their capabilities are being questioned." That night, as George lay in bed looking up at the ornate ceiling of his room, he thought about his father's words. He also thought about Thompson, about the subtle signs of discomfort he had observed, and about the weight of responsibility that everyone in the palace carried in their own way. George had been raised to understand that being royal meant thinking about others, about service, and about using his position to make positive differences in people's lives. But this felt different from the formal charitable work and public appearances that were part of his royal education. This felt personal and immediate. He thought about the delicate balance that existed in the palace. Everyone had their role to play, and there was an unspoken understanding that the machinery of royal life must continue to run smoothly. But what happened when someone was struggling? What happened when pride or fear prevented someone from seeking the help they needed? As sleep finally began to take hold, George made a decision. Tomorrow he would pay closer attention. He would observe not just Thompson but others around the palace. He would try to understand better what was happening and whether there was something he could do to help. The next morning brought with it a sense of purpose that George hadn't felt before. As he dressed for the day ahead, he thought about the power of observation, about the responsibility that came with noticing when others were in need, and about the quiet ways that compassion could be expressed. Little did he know that his decision to pay attention, to truly see the people around him, would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately change not just Thompson's life, but George's understanding of what it truly meant to be royal. Sometimes the most profound acts of leadership happened not in grand public gestures, but in the quiet moments when one person chose to see another's struggle and respond with genuine care. The day ahead would bring new observations, deeper understanding, and the beginning of a plan that would demonstrate wisdom far beyond George's 10 years. The next few days brought a new routine for George. While maintaining his regular schedule of lessons, meals, and royal duties, he began what he privately called his observation project. It wasn't anything dramatic or obvious, just a young boy paying closer attention to the world around him. During his morning walk to breakfast, George noticed that Thompson's discomfort seemed to be getting worse rather than better. The guard was now clearly favoring his right leg, and the subtle touches to his lower back had become more frequent. What concerned George most was that Thompson was clearly trying to hide his pain, straightening up quickly whenever he noticed anyone approaching. George also began to notice other things about the palace dynamics that he had previously overlooked. The way the senior staff members occasionally whispered among themselves when they thought no one was watching. The slight tension that seemed to exist around discussions of staffing and schedules. The careful way everyone maintained their professional composure, even when it was clear that something was bothering them. One morning, as George was reading in the palace library, he overheard a conversation between two senior staff members that made everything clearer. They were discussing the upcoming security review, a routine evaluation that happened annually but carried significant weight for everyone involved. "Thompson's been with us for 8 years now," one of them said quietly. "Exemplary service record. But you know how thorough these reviews are. They look at everything. Fitness assessments, reaction times, medical evaluations. He's been one of our most reliable people," the other replied. It would be a real loss if he couldn't continue in his current role. George felt a chill run down his spine. Now he understood what was happening. Thompson wasn't just dealing with some minor discomfort. He was struggling with an injury or condition that could potentially end his career in royal protection. And he was trying to hide it because he was afraid of losing his job. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Thompson's tension, his careful movements, his attempts to hide his pain, all of it made sense now. He was a man caught between his physical limitations and his dedication to his job, trying desperately to maintain the standards expected of him, while dealing with something that was clearly affecting his ability to perform at his best. That afternoon, George found himself walking past Thompson's post again, but this time he saw the situation with completely new eyes. This wasn't just about one man's physical discomfort. It was about dignity, about pride, about the fear of being seen as no longer capable of doing the job you loved. George remembered a conversation he had had with his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, before she passed away. She had told him that true leadership often meant seeing not just what people showed you, but understanding what they were trying to hide. Sometimes, she had said, the greatest kindness comes from helping people preserve their dignity while still receiving the help they need. As George continued his daily routines over the next few days, he began to formulate an idea. It was subtle, perhaps even a bit mischievous, but it felt right. The plan required careful timing and a deep understanding of how the palace operated. But George had been observing royal protocol his entire life. The key, he realized, was to create a situation where Thompson could receive help without it appearing to be charity or accommodation for a weakness. It needed to feel natural, even beneficial to the palace operations, rather than like someone had noticed his struggle and was taking pity on him. George spent several days refining his plan, thinking through every possible consequence and considering how each person involved might react. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong move could make Thompson's situation worse rather than better. The breakthrough came during a conversation with his father about palace security. Prince William was explaining how security arrangements were constantly evolving to meet new challenges and how different posts required different types of skills and experience. Sometimes, his father had mentioned, our most experienced guards are the ones who understand that effective security isn't always about physical readiness. Experience, judgment, and the ability to read situations can be just as valuable as quick reflexes. That's when George knew exactly what he needed to do. The solution wasn't to get Thompson help for his physical issues, it was to create a situation where his value to the royal household could be recognized in a way that didn't require him to hide his limitations. George began to pay attention to the palace's communication patterns, the schedules, and the various routine evaluations and meetings that kept the royal household functioning smoothly. He noticed when security briefings were held, when staff assignments were reviewed, and when decisions were made about personnel placement. Most importantly, he began to understand the subtle ways that information flowed through the palace hierarchy. A casual comment to the right person at the right time could plant a seed that might grow into exactly the kind of solution Thompson needed. George also spent time thinking about timing. He knew that the annual security review was approaching, which meant that any changes or recommendations needed to be made soon. But he also knew that he couldn't appear to be interfering or manipulating the situation. Everything had to seem natural and logical. One evening, as George was having his usual bedtime conversation with his father, he decided to take the first step in his plan. The conversation had turned to the topic of mentorship and how experienced people could help train and guide those who were newer to their roles. "Father," George said thoughtfully, "do you think there's value in having experienced guards work with newer ones? I mean, to share their knowledge and help train them?" Prince William nodded approvingly. "Absolutely. Some of our best security innovations have come from experienced staff members, sharing their insights with newer team members." "Why do you ask?" "I was just thinking about how much Mr. Thompson seems to understand about the palace and how things work. He always seems to know exactly what's happening and when. It made me wonder if that kind of experience could be helpful to other guards who are still learning." It was a small seed, carefully planted. George knew that his father would file away this observation, and that it might resurface at exactly the right moment during discussions about staffing and assignments. Over the next few days, George continued to lay the groundwork for his plan, making casual observations and comments that highlighted Thompson's strengths, while never once mentioning his physical challenges. Each comment was designed to shift the focus from what Thompson might not be able to do anymore to what he could uniquely contribute to the royal protection team. The beauty of George's approach was its subtlety. He wasn't asking anyone to help Thompson. He was simply helping people notice Thompson's value in a new way. And sometimes that kind of shift in perspective was all that was needed to create opportunities that hadn't existed before. George's plan began to take shape more clearly as he observed the daily rhythms of palace life with new intensity. He noticed that Thompson possessed something that couldn't be taught in training, manuals or learned through standard procedures, an intuitive understanding of the palace's emotional climate during a minor incident involving a delivery that hadn't been properly scheduled. George watched as Thompson smoothly redirected the situation without creating any disruption or embarrassment for the delivery person. It was the kind of diplomatic handling that required years of experience and genuine understanding of how to maintain both security and courtesy. That evening, George found an opportunity to mention this observation to his mother during their quiet time together before bed. Princess Catherine was reviewing some correspondence when George settled beside her with a thoughtful expression. "Mummy, I noticed something interesting today," he began carefully. "When there was that confusion with the delivery this morning, Mr. Thompson handled it so smoothly. The delivery man didn't even realize there had been a problem." Princess Catherine looked up from her papers, always interested when George shared his observations about palace life. That's very observant of you, darling. What did you notice specifically? Well, he could have just turned the man away or made it feel like he had done something wrong. But instead, Mr. Thompson explained the proper procedure in a way that made it seem helpful rather than critical. The man left feeling good about the interaction, even though his paperwork wasn't quite right. That's an excellent observation, George. That kind of judgment and diplomatic skill is quite valuable. It's not always about following rules rigidly. Sometimes it's about understanding the spirit behind the rules and finding ways to uphold security while treating people with kindness. George nodded earnestly. It made me think about how much experience must go into knowing how to handle situations like that. Someone new might not have known how to balance everything so well. These conversations were part of George's larger strategy. He was building a case not through direct advocacy, but through helping the people around him notice Thompson's unique value. Each observation was genuine. George wasn't making anything up, but he was choosing to highlight specific strengths that he hoped would become relevant when decisions were being made about Thompson's future. A few days later, George's patience paid off in an unexpected way. During his morning lessons, he overheard part of a phone conversation that his father was having with the head of palace security. While George couldn't hear the entire discussion, he caught enough to understand that they were indeed reviewing personnel assignments and discussing how to best utilize the experience of senior staff members. This gave George an idea for the next phase of his plan. Rather than continuing to make indirect comments, he decided to create a situation where Thompson's expertise would naturally come to the forefront. George knew that his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, would be participating in a small family event at the palace the following week. Security arrangements for events involving the children were always carefully planned, but they also provided opportunities for experienced staff to demonstrate their value in ways that went beyond physical requirements. During dinner that evening, George steered the conversation toward the upcoming family event. "I'm looking forward to showing Charlotte and Louis some of the historical parts of the palace during their visit," he mentioned casually. "That sounds lovely," Princess Catherine replied. "We'll need to coordinate with security to make sure the areas you want to visit are properly prepared. I was thinking," George continued thoughtfully, "it might be nice to have someone with us who really understands the history and can help explain things to Charlotte and Louis, someone who knows all the protocols but also knows how to make it interesting for them." Prince William nodded approvingly. "That's a thoughtful idea. It would be helpful to have someone who understands both the security requirements and how to work well with children." George's suggestion was perfectly innocent, but he knew that when the security team reviewed staffing for the event, they would naturally consider who among their personnel had both the experience and the temperament to handle such an assignment effectively. Thompson's years of experience and his gentle diplomatic nature would make him an ideal candidate for such a role. The following morning, George made sure to walk past Thompson's post on his way to breakfast. This time, instead of simply offering a greeting, he paused for a brief conversation. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I hope you're having a pleasant day." "Good morning, Prince George." "Yes, thank you. I hope your studies are going well." "They are, thank you. I've been learning about the history of some of the rooms in the East Wing. It's fascinating how much story these walls hold." Thompson's face brightened slightly. "Indeed they do, Your Highness. I've always found the history of this place quite remarkable. Each room has witnessed so much over the centuries." "You seem to know quite a lot about the palace's history," George observed genuinely. "Well, when you spend 8 years walking these halls, you pick up quite a bit," Thompson replied with a modest smile. The older staff members have shared many stories over the years. This brief exchange accomplished exactly what George had hoped. It established Thompson's knowledge and interest in palace history, while also subtly acknowledging his years of service and his good relationships with other staff members. More importantly, it demonstrated his natural ability to communicate respectfully with royal family members while maintaining appropriate protocol. Over the next few days, George continued to notice and mentally catalog Thompson's interactions with various people throughout the palace. He observed how Thompson handled different types of situations, how he communicated with both senior staff and newer employees, and how he maintained his professionalism even when clearly dealing with physical discomfort. What struck George most was Thompson's genuine care for the people around him. During a moment when a newer guard seemed uncertain about a procedure, George watched as Thompson quietly provided guidance without making the younger man feel inadequate. When a staff member was struggling with a heavy delivery, Thompson stepped in to help despite his own limitations. These observations reinforced George's conviction that Thompson's value to the royal household extended far beyond his physical capabilities. He possessed institutional knowledge, diplomatic skills, and a caring nature that would be difficult to replace. The challenge was helping the decision-makers recognize these qualities as assets, rather than focusing on any physical limitations he might be experiencing. As the week progressed, George began to hear fragments of conversations that suggested his subtle campaign was having an effect. References to utilizing senior staff expertise and mentorship opportunities began appearing in discussions about palace operations. While George couldn't be certain that these conversations were directly related to Thompson's situation, he felt hopeful that his efforts were contributing to a broader consideration of how experienced staff members could best serve the royal household. The real test would come with the upcoming family event and the security assignments that would be made for it. George knew that if Thompson was chosen for a role that highlighted his strengths rather than his physical limitations, it could set a precedent that might influence future decisions about his career. The morning of the family event arrived with typical palace efficiency. George woke early, partly from excitement about spending time with his siblings, but mostly from nervous anticipation about whether his subtle plan would come to fruition. As he dressed for the day, he wondered if Thompson would be assigned to their security detail. When George made his way to breakfast, he deliberately chose a route that would take him past the main security briefing room. Through the partially open door, he could hear the familiar sounds of the morning security meeting, the quiet discussions of schedules, assignments, and protocols that kept the royal household running smoothly. As he walked past, George caught sight of Thompson inside the room, sitting at the briefing table with several other security personnel. What struck George immediately was Thompson's posture. He was sitting up straight, looking alert and engaged, but George could tell that he was grateful to be seated rather than standing for an extended period. During breakfast, George found it difficult to concentrate on his meal. His parents chatted about the day's activities and their excitement about the family gathering, but George's mind was focused on what assignments would emerge from the morning briefing. His answer came sooner than expected. About halfway through breakfast, one of the senior security coordinators approached their table with the day's security overview, a routine briefing that happened before any family events. "Good morning, Your Royal Highnesses," the coordinator began respectfully. "I wanted to review today's security arrangements with you." As the coordinator outlined the general security plan, George listened carefully for any mention of specific personnel assignments. Finally, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. "For the family tour of the historical rooms, we've assigned Guard Thompson to accompany you. His extensive knowledge of the palace and experience with family events make him an ideal choice for this type of assignment." George felt a surge of satisfaction, but he was careful to keep his expression neutral. His father nodded approvingly at the assignment and his mother smiled, clearly pleased with the choice. "Excellent," Prince William said. "Thompson has always been very professional and knowledgeable. I'm sure he'll do a wonderful job with the children." After breakfast, George made his way to his usual morning lessons, but his mind kept returning to what had just happened. The security team had chosen Thompson for exactly the reasons George had hoped they would: his experience, his knowledge, and his ability to work well with the royal family. Most importantly, they had chosen him for a role that highlighted his strengths rather than requiring the physical demands that might be challenging for him. During his mathematics lesson, George found himself thinking about the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about helping one person. It was about recognizing that value and contribution could take many different forms. Thompson's years of dedicated service had given him skills and knowledge that were different from, but just as important as, physical capabilities. When the family gathering began that afternoon, George was eager to see how Thompson would handle his new role. As Charlotte and Louis arrived with their parents, George watched as Thompson seamlessly integrated into the group dynamics. He was positioned strategically to maintain security oversight while also being available to provide historical context and answer questions. What impressed George most was how Naturally, Thompson adapted to the educational aspect of his assignment. When Charlotte asked about a particular portrait, Thompson was able to provide not just historical facts but also interesting stories that captured a 7-year-old's imagination. When Louis became restless during a longer explanation, Thompson smoothly suggested they move to a room with more interactive elements. Throughout the afternoon, George observed Thompson's performance with growing admiration. The guard was clearly in his element, sharing knowledge he had accumulated over years of working in the palace while maintaining perfect security awareness. His slight physical limitations were completely irrelevant in this context. In fact, his calmer, more measured pace seemed to work perfectly with the children's attention spans. George also noticed that Thompson seemed more relaxed and confident than he had in weeks. The tension that had been evident in his posture was largely gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of someone who was doing meaningful work that utilized his strengths. During a quiet moment when Charlotte and Louis were examining some historical artifacts with their parents, George found himself standing near Thompson. The guard was monitoring the room's security while also keeping a watchful eye on the children's activities. "This is fascinating, Mr. Thompson," George said quietly. "I had no idea there were so many interesting stories connected to these rooms." "Thank you, Prince George. I've always enjoyed the historical aspects of working here. Each room has such rich stories, and it's particularly rewarding to share them with young people who are genuinely interested." "You're very good at explaining things in a way that makes them interesting," George observed. "Charlotte and Louis are completely engaged, which isn't always easy to achieve." Thompson smiled with genuine pleasure. "Well, I've learned that history comes alive when you can connect it to real people and their experiences. These rooms aren't just museum pieces, they're places where real life happened." As the afternoon continued, George began to overhear conversations between his parents and other staff members that suggested Thompson's performance was being noticed and appreciated. His mother commented to one of the coordinators about how well Thompson was managing both the security and educational aspects of his role. His father mentioned to another staff member that Thompson's knowledge and communication skills were impressive. These observations were exactly what George had hoped would happen. Thompson was demonstrating his value in a context that didn't require him to hide or compensate for any physical limitations. Instead, he was showcasing skills and knowledge that could only come from years of dedicated service and genuine interest in his work. Near the end of the afternoon, as the family gathering was winding down, George overheard a conversation that made his heart skip with excitement. Two senior staff members were discussing Thompson's performance and how well-suited he seemed to be for this type of assignment. "He really seemed to thrive in that role," one of them was saying. "His communication skills with the children were excellent, and he never lost sight of the security requirements. It's good to see someone with his experience being utilized in a way that really highlights his strengths," the other replied. "Perhaps we should consider similar assignments for other experienced staff members." As George prepared for bed that evening, he reflected on the day's events with deep satisfaction. His careful, subtle campaign had succeeded in creating an opportunity for Thompson to demonstrate his value in a new context. More importantly, it had helped the palace leadership recognize that experienced staff members could contribute in ways that went beyond traditional role definitions. But George also realized that this was just the beginning. The real test would be whether this single successful assignment would lead to longer-term changes in how Thompson's career path was viewed. Would the security review now take into account his demonstrated skills in educational and diplomatic roles? Would the palace leadership consider creating new types of positions that could utilize the expertise of experienced staff members? As he drifted off to sleep, George felt proud of what he had accomplished, but also thoughtful about the broader lessons the experience had taught him. Sometimes the most powerful interventions were the ones that helped people see familiar situations in new ways. By highlighting Thompson's strengths rather than trying to address his limitations directly, George had helped create a solution that preserved the guard's dignity while also serving the palace's needs effectively. The weeks following the family event brought a noticeable shift in the palace atmosphere, at least from George's observant perspective. Thompson seemed to carry himself differently. There was a renewed confidence in his step and a brightness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. More importantly, George began to notice that Thompson was being included in different types of assignments and conversations. George's morning walks through the palace corridors became informal intelligence-gathering missions. He noticed that Thompson was increasingly being consulted on matters that had more to do with protocol and palace operations than with traditional security duties. During one morning, George observed Thompson in deep conversation with a palace events coordinator, apparently providing input on security considerations for an upcoming diplomatic reception. What particularly pleased George was that Thompson's physical limitations seemed to be becoming less of a concern as his other skills gained recognition. The guard was still assigned to posts that required security vigilance, but these assignments were increasingly chosen to utilize his diplomatic skills and institutional knowledge rather than requiring extensive physical mobility. During a conversation with his tutor, Mrs. Hamilton, George found an opportunity to process what he was observing without revealing his role in the changes. Mrs. Hamilton, George began thoughtfully during a break in their history lesson. I've been thinking about how people's careers can evolve as they gain experience. Do you think there's value in finding new ways for experienced workers to contribute as they get older? Mrs. Hamilton looked at her young student with interest. That's a very mature question, George. Yes, I think one of the hallmarks of good organizations is their ability to recognize that people's strengths can change and develop over time. Someone who might have started in one type of role might discover they have talents that are better suited to different responsibilities. But what if the person is worried that asking for different responsibilities might make them seem like they can't do their original job anymore? George asked. That's the delicate part, Mrs. Hamilton replied. Pride and fear of being seen as inadequate can prevent people from seeking roles that might actually be better suited to their evolving skills. That's why it's often helpful when organizations proactively recognize people's developing strengths and create opportunities for them. George nodded, feeling validated in his approach. He had instinctively understood that Thompson needed an opportunity to showcase his strengths, rather than being put in a position where he had to admit to limitations. A few days later, George's patience and observation skills were rewarded with an even more significant development. During his afternoon walk, he noticed Thompson in the palace library, not as a security guard, but apparently conducting some kind of research. George was intrigued enough to find a reason to enter the library himself. Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson, George said politely as he approached the section where Thompson was working. Good afternoon, Prince George, Thompson replied, looking up from a stack of historical documents and books. I hope your studies are going well today. They are, thank you. I couldn't help but notice you're doing some research. Is this for a security matter? Thompson smiled, and George could see genuine enthusiasm in his expression. Actually, I've been asked to help develop some educational materials about the palace's history for future family tours and diplomatic visits. Apparently, my performance during your recent family gathering impressed some of the senior staff. George felt a surge of excitement, but worked to keep his expression merely politely interested. That sounds like fascinating work. You certainly seem to know a great deal about the palace's history during our tour. Well, 8 years of walking these halls and listening to stories from older staff members has taught me quite a bit. I'm finding it very rewarding to organize that knowledge in a way that might be helpful to others. As George continued his conversation with Thompson, he learned that this research assignment was just the beginning. The palace administration was apparently considering creating a new position that would combine security awareness with educational and diplomatic functions. Thompson was being given the opportunity to help define what such a position might look like. This development exceeded George's most optimistic expectations. Not only had his subtle campaign helped Thompson find a way to contribute that didn't aggravate his physical limitations, but it had also led to the creation of entirely new opportunities within the palace structure. That evening, during dinner with his parents, George found it difficult to contain his satisfaction. When the conversation turned to palace operations, he couldn't resist making a subtle inquiry about the developments he had observed. I noticed Mr. Thompson in the library today, doing some kind of research, George mentioned casually. It looked like interesting work. Yes, Prince William replied. The security team has been exploring ways to better utilize the institutional knowledge that our experienced staff members possess. Thompson's performance during the family tour highlighted some interesting possibilities. What kind of possibilities? George asked, genuinely curious about the direction his plan had taken. Well, We're considering developing hybrid positions that combine traditional security functions with educational and diplomatic responsibilities, Princess Catherine explained. There's real value in having staff members who understand both security requirements and palace history, especially for events involving children or educational tours. George nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Someone with experience would understand how to balance safety with making visits meaningful and interesting. Exactly, his father agreed. And it provides career development opportunities for long-term staff members who have demonstrated dedication and accumulated valuable knowledge over their years of service. Over the following days, George continued to observe the evolution of Thompson's role with fascination. The guard was spending increasing amounts of time on research and planning activities, while still maintaining his security responsibilities. More importantly, he was clearly thriving in this expanded role. George also began to notice that Thompson's success was having broader effects on palace operations. Other experienced staff members were being consulted more frequently on matters related to their areas of expertise. There seemed to be a growing recognition that years of service created valuable institutional knowledge that could be better utilized. During one of his morning walks, George encountered Thompson in conversation with a newer security guard. Rather than the traditional hierarchical training that George might have expected, this appeared to be a collaborative discussion about how to handle various types of situations that might arise during palace events. The key, George heard Thompson saying, is to remember that security isn't just about preventing problems. It's also about helping events run smoothly so that everyone can focus on what they're there to accomplish. This observation struck George as particularly insightful. Thompson was sharing not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about how to approach his work in a way that served the larger purposes of the royal household. As George reflected on the developments he had witnessed, he realized that his intervention had succeeded beyond his original intentions. He had set out to help one person find a way to continue contributing, despite physical limitations, but the process had also highlighted broader opportunities for organizational improvement. The experience was teaching George important lessons about leadership and problem-solving. Sometimes the most effective interventions were those that created value for everyone involved, rather than simply addressing one person's immediate needs. By helping the palace leadership recognize Thompson's unique strengths, George had contributed to solutions that benefited Thompson, the royal household, and potentially other staff members as well. But perhaps most importantly, George was learning that true compassion often required patience, subtlety, and deep observation rather than immediate action. The most sustainable solutions were those that emerged naturally from genuine recognition of people's strengths rather than from artificial accommodations for their limitations. Several months had passed since George first noticed Thompson's subtle struggle, and the transformation in the palace environment had become unmistakable. What had begun as one young prince's compassionate observation had evolved into a broader organizational shift that was benefiting multiple staff members and improving palace operations. Overall, George's morning walks had become a source of quiet satisfaction as he observed the positive changes taking place. Thompson was now officially designated as the Heritage Security Coordinator, a newly created position that perfectly balanced his security expertise with his knowledge of palace history and protocol. The role involved planning and overseeing security for educational tours, diplomatic visits, and special events that required both protection and cultural expertise. More significantly, Thompson's success had inspired the creation of similar hybrid positions for other experienced staff members. The palace administration had recognized that their long-term employees possessed institutional knowledge and specialized skills that could be better utilized through creative role definitions. During one particularly memorable morning, George encountered Thompson leading a small group of newer security personnel through what appeared to be a training exercise. But this wasn't traditional security training. Thompson was teaching them how to balance security requirements with diplomatic courtesy during high-profile visits. Remember, Thompson was explaining to the group, our job isn't just to protect. It's to protect in a way that allows important relationships and communications to flourish. Sometimes the most effective security is nearly invisible to the people we're protecting. George paused nearby, pretending to examine a historical portrait while listening to Thompson's instruction. The guard was clearly thriving in his teaching role, sharing hard-won wisdom about the delicate balance between vigilance and diplomacy that was essential in royal service. What struck George most powerfully was the evident respect that the newer guards showed. Thompson, they weren't receiving his instruction as charity or accommodation. They were learning from someone whose experience and expertise were clearly valued. Thompson had successfully transitioned from being someone who might be seen as limited by physical challenges to being recognized as a mentor and expert whose knowledge was actively sought. That evening, during a family dinner conversation about palace operations, George learned more about the broader impact of the changes he had helped initiate. The Heritage Security Program has been remarkably successful, Prince William was telling Princess Catherine. Thompson's approach to combining protection with cultural education has impressed several visiting dignitaries. They've commented on how seamlessly our security personnel integrate historical knowledge with their protective duties. It's also had unexpected benefits for staff morale, Princess Catherine added. Several long-term employees have expressed appreciation for the recognition that their accumulated knowledge and experience are valued assets rather than just byproducts of their tenure. George felt a deep sense of pride hearing this, but he was careful not to reveal his role in the developments. Instead, he simply observed, "It seems like a very logical way to utilize people's strengths and experience." Indeed, his father agreed. Sometimes the best innovations come from recognizing potential that was always there, but hadn't been properly identified or channeled. A few days later, George had an opportunity to observe Thompson in his new role during a visit from a group of Commonwealth Youth Ambassadors. The young visitors were receiving a special tour of the palace as part of their diplomatic program, and Thompson was responsible for both their security and their educational experience. George watched from a discreet distance as Thompson guided the group through several historical rooms, seamlessly weaving together stories of royal history, constitutional development, and Commonwealth relationships. His knowledge was impressive, but what struck George even more was Thompson's natural ability to engage with young people, answering their questions thoughtfully and encouraging their curiosity about history and governance. During a break in the tour, George approached Thompson to offer his compliments on the excellent presentation. "Mr. Thompson, I couldn't help but notice how engaged those young ambassadors were during your tour. You have a real gift for making history come alive." Thompson's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, Prince George. It's remarkably rewarding work. I find that young people are naturally curious about how institutions develop and change over time, especially when you can connect historical events to contemporary issues they care about." "Have you always been interested in teaching?" George asked. "I suppose I have, though I never really thought of it that way when I was focused purely on security duties," Thompson replied thoughtfully. "But working here for so many years, listening to the stories older staff members shared, and observing how the palace operates, it all combined to give me a perspective that apparently has value for others." As their conversation continued, George realized that Thompson had found not just a solution to his physical limitations, but a calling that was deeply fulfilling. The guard's enthusiasm for his work was evident, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who knew his contributions were valued and meaningful. Several weeks later, George learned that Thompson's success had caught the attention of other royal residences. Requests were coming in for Thompson to help develop similar heritage security programs at other locations, and there was discussion of his potentially traveling to train security personnel at various Commonwealth locations. This development presented Thompson with exciting career opportunities that would have been unimaginable in his previous role. His expertise was now sought after, and his physical limitations were completely irrelevant to his professional success. During a quiet moment in the palace library, where George often went to think and reflect, he considered the broader lessons his experience with Thompson had taught him. He had learned that effective leadership often meant seeing potential that others missed, and that the most sustainable solutions were those that created value for everyone involved. George had also discovered that patience and subtlety could be more powerful than direct intervention. By helping others recognize Thompson's strengths rather than trying to solve his problems directly, George had contributed to a solution that preserved Thompson's dignity while also benefiting the entire organization. Perhaps most importantly, George had learned that true compassion required deep observation and understanding. It wasn't enough to notice that someone was struggling. Effective help required understanding the nature of their struggle and finding ways to address it that honored their pride and preserved their sense of purpose. As George reflected on these lessons, he realized that his experience with Thompson had prepared him for future leadership challenges. The skills of observation, patience, and strategic thinking that he had developed would serve him well as he grew into his royal responsibilities. The palace corridors that George walked each morning were now filled with evidence of positive change. Thompson's transformation from a struggling guard to a respected heritage security coordinator had inspired broader recognition of how experienced staff members could contribute to palace operations. Other employees were being given opportunities to utilize their accumulated knowledge and expertise in new ways. George had learned that sometimes the most profound leadership came not from grand gestures or formal authority, but from the quiet work of helping others recognize possibilities they hadn't seen before. His subtle intervention had created ripple effects that continued to benefit people throughout the palace community. As he prepared for bed each evening, George often thought about the responsibility that came with the power to observe and influence. He had learned that with careful attention and thoughtful action, even a young person could make meaningful differences in the lives of others. The key was to act with wisdom, patience, and genuine care for the well-being and dignity of everyone involved. Nearly a year had passed since George first noticed Thompson's quiet struggle, and the palace had settled into its new rhythms. The Heritage Security Program had become so successful that it was being studied by security services at royal residences throughout Europe. Thompson had evolved from a guard facing potential career difficulties to an internationally recognized expert in diplomatic security education. On a crisp autumn morning, George was walking through the same corridor where he had first observed Thompson's discomfort. The guard was there at his post, but everything about the scene had changed. Thompson stood with quiet confidence, no longer fighting to hide physical limitations, but instead positioned in a role that utilized his strengths perfectly. He was reviewing plans for an upcoming state visit, his expertise now essential to ensuring both security and cultural diplomacy. As George approached, Thompson looked up with a warm smile that reflected genuine contentment with his work and his role in the palace community. "Good morning, Prince George. I trust you're well today?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Thompson. I see you're preparing for the state visit next week. It looks like quite an elaborate plan." "Indeed it is," Thompson replied with evident enthusiasm. "We're hosting delegates from 6 different Commonwealth nations, each with their own cultural protocols and security requirements. It's exactly the kind of challenge that makes this work so rewarding." George marveled at the transformation in Thompson's demeanor. The tension and worry that had once characterized his posture had been replaced by the confident bearing of someone who knew his value was recognized and his contributions were essential. "I imagine your experience has been invaluable in planning such a complex event," George observed. "Well, the combination of security training and cultural knowledge does seem to be useful for these situations," Thompson acknowledged. "But more than that, I've learned that the best security comes from understanding people, their needs, their concerns, their cultural expectations. When you can create an environment where everyone feels respected and comfortable, security becomes much more manageable." As they talked, George reflected on how much had changed, not just for Thompson but for the entire palace operation. The success of the Heritage Security Program had led to other innovations in how the royal household utilized the expertise of its staff members. Long-term employees in various departments were being given opportunities to mentor newer staff, contribute to policy development, and share their institutional knowledge in ways that benefited everyone. Later that morning, during his lessons with Mrs. Hamilton, George found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he had witnessed and helped facilitate. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said during a break in their studies, "I've been thinking about how small actions can sometimes lead to much larger changes. Do you think one person can really make a significant difference in an organization?" Mrs. Hamilton set down her papers and looked at George with interest. "That's a profound question, George. I think history is full of examples of individuals whose observations, insights, or actions created ripple effects that led to much broader positive changes. Sometimes the most important leadership happens quietly, through understanding and patience rather than dramatic gestures. What do you think makes the difference between actions that create positive change and those that don't? George asked. I believe it often comes down to whether the action serves only immediate needs or whether it addresses underlying issues in ways that benefit everyone involved. Mrs. Hamilton replied thoughtfully. The most sustainable changes usually come from helping people recognize possibilities they hadn't seen before, rather than from trying to impose solutions from the outside. George nodded, thinking about how accurately this description matched his approach with Thompson. He hadn't tried to solve Thompson's problem directly. Instead, he had helped others recognize Thompson's value in a new context. That afternoon, George learned that Thompson had received an invitation to speak at an international conference on security and cultural diplomacy. The invitation specifically referenced his innovative work in developing educational security protocols for royal and diplomatic environments. Thompson had gone from being a guard worried about his career prospects to being recognized as an expert whose insights were sought by security professionals around the world. During dinner that evening, George's parents shared news that filled him with quiet pride. Thompson's heritage security program has been so successful that we're being asked to share our model with other royal households, Prince William announced. The combination of traditional security with cultural education has impressed visitors from several countries. It's also had wonderful effects on staff satisfaction, Princess Catherine added. Several long-term employees have told me how much they appreciate the recognition that their experience and knowledge are valued assets. It's created a sense that career development doesn't end after a certain number of years. It just takes different forms. George felt a deep sense of satisfaction hearing this. His intervention had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations, creating benefits not just for Thompson but for the entire palace community. A few weeks later, George had an opportunity to see the full flowering of the changes he had helped initiate. During a major diplomatic reception, he observed Thompson in action, seamlessly coordinating security protocols while also providing cultural context for visiting dignitaries. The guard moved through the event with quiet authority, his expertise evident in how smoothly everything proceeded. What struck George most powerfully was watching. Thompson mentored two younger guards who were learning to balance security requirements with diplomatic courtesy. The respect and attention they paid to Thompson's instruction demonstrated how completely his role had transformed. He was no longer someone accommodated despite limitations, but someone whose expertise was essential and actively sought. As the evening progressed, George overheard several visiting security officials commenting admiringly on the palace's approach to diplomatic security. They were particularly impressed by how the security personnel seemed to enhance, rather than merely monitor, the cultural and educational aspects of the visit. During a quiet moment, George approached Thompson to congratulate him on the evening's success. Mr. Thompson, everything seems to be proceeding beautifully this evening. Your planning and coordination are clearly excellent. Thank you, Prince George. It's gratifying to see all the preparation come together successfully, but more than that, it's wonderful to be doing work that feels truly meaningful, work that contributes to building understanding and relationships between different countries and cultures. As George reflected on Thompson's words, he realized that his intervention had accomplished something even more significant than he had originally intended. He hadn't just helped one person find a way to continue his career. He had helped create opportunities for that person to discover new purpose and meaning in his work. The experience had taught George profound lessons about leadership, compassion, and the power of patient observation. He had learned that the most effective interventions were often the most subtle ones, and that true leadership sometimes meant helping others recognize their own potential, rather than trying to solve their problems directly. As George prepared for bed that night, he thought about the responsibility that would come with his future role as king, the skills he had developed through his experience with Thompson, careful observation, patient strategy, and genuine concern for others' well-being and dignity would serve him well in addressing the complex challenges that lay ahead. More importantly, George had learned that even small acts of compassion and wisdom could create positive changes that extended far beyond their original scope. His intervention had not only helped Thompson, but had also improved palace operations, created new opportunities for other staff members, and contributed to innovations in diplomatic security that were being recognized internationally. The palace corridors that George walked each morning were now filled with evidence of these positive changes. The Heritage Security Program continued to evolve and improve. Other departments had developed similar programs to utilize the expertise of experienced staff, and there was a general sense throughout the palace community that everyone's contributions were valued and that career development could take many different forms. As George drifted off to sleep, he felt profound satisfaction in knowing that his careful observation and thoughtful action had made a real difference in people's lives. He had learned that true leadership often happened quietly, through understanding and patience rather than dramatic gestures, and that the most sustainable positive changes came from helping people recognize possibilities they hadn't seen before. The experience had prepared him well for future challenges and had shown him that even as a young person, he could make meaningful contributions to the well-being of others through careful attention, strategic thinking, and genuine compassion.